Eric, I am honored to have you on the show. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And, we put some information about you when we promote the episode. But why don't you start with your story?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, yeah, my story. Well, there's a lot to my story. I'll kind of give you some highline based on a conversation we had a minute ago. Similar to you, post-college, kind of found myself in a very difficult moment of life. I didn't know how to explain it then, but I was having kind of a crisis of identity, a crisis of relationship, a crisis of a direction. And I played soccer through college. I thought that was a career path for me. And when the opportunity came to try and travel to Europe to see if I could pick up on some teams over there, because this is back before soccer was as popular as it is here in the States now, I went to a very dark place. This is traumatic divorce with my parents, and my family was just torn to pieces. And that really was, up to that point in my life, that was my compass. That was my point of orientation. When I didn't know what I was doing or where I was going or what was up from down, home was always my point of orientation. And now all of a sudden that's gone. And long story short, I was not looking for this experience, but through some friendships, I ended up having a very powerful experience with what I call God. And that kind of set me on a totally different track. For the first time, I was trying to make sense of who I am from a spiritual perspective, which was new. I was trying to make sense of how I fit in the world, what I'm going to do with my life as a new Christian. And, there's not a lot out there. It wasn't like a lot of books on how to figure all this stuff out, but I was thankful that my older brother took me under his wing and invested in me for the next couple of years. During that time, I was like many post-college people trying to find just some different jobs to begin to explore some different career paths before I would decide on what I would do for grad school. And I think partly because of my personality and I like public communication, there were people kept saying, "Oh, you'd make a great pastor," because I got involved in a church. "You make a great pastor, you make a great pastor." And I remember thinking, I don't know that I'd make a great pastor, but I am intrigued by, studying the scripture and all these different spiritual things that I was learning. And so I said, I'll try out seminary, which is, obviously for your listeners who don't know, that's like post-grad work if you want to go into church work. And I explored that and simultaneously got involved in that local church, got on staff, and, just over time, finished up that seminary degree, worked in a variety of churches over the next 7 to 8 years, and realized this I'm not a good fit for this space. Like I said earlier, I'm maybe too pioneering, too entrepreneurial, too forward thinking for institutions that really kind of the predominant culture is kind of like, hey, we want to make sure that we keep things the way they are for the most part. So along that journey, I met an older gentleman, a British man, who was talking about discipleship within the life of the church, but in a way I'd never heard it talked about, because the conversation around discipleship in the church was largely workbooks and curriculum and knowledge based, like knowledge acquisition and regurgitation. And if you were a mature Christian, you had memorized scripture, you could regurgitate a lot of information. But the thing that always struck me was, I don't know that I see a correlation between how much information somebody knows about the Bible and a real transformative impact in their life. And I don't mean to be judgmental. It's just what I was watching. And by this point, working at a variety of churches, I had seen all these leaders that when I first entered under their leadership seemed like they were bigger than life, and only to find out they really weren't fighting for the kind
they're flawed too.
They're not only flawed.
We're all flawed.
100%. But they were not only flawed, there was almost, I started picking up on a veneer of like, and we don't talk about that other stuff. That was my experience. So I met this other gentleman, and he introduced me to this kind of approach to discipleship, which I later came to discover was much more rooted in the biblical perspective of the rabbinic model of discipleship, the rabbi disciple relationship. There's been a lot of people since then who have talked about this and unpacked it, but really it's much more of a life on life, mentor, mentee, parent, child, whatever metaphor works, where it's, hey, I'm not just going to show you how to do what I do. I'm going to show you how I've become who I am. And that captured my heart. And so I stayed working with this gentleman on this stuff. He started a coaching business. And so I went from working in the church to working with churches for another 10 years. And it was fantastic. And I learned a lot. And I never intended to get into the world of coaching. And law would have been my fallback if stuff didn't work in the church. I was going to go back to law school. Now I know I would have made a terrible lawyer because I have a terrible attention to detail. But during this time of working with churches, two things I realized. Number one, I fell in love with the work of coaching, because coaching, really what coaching means is it's training, right? It's just a form of training. And the methodology that I was learning about coaching and training was so unique that people hadn't experienced it before. And it was really transformative in terms of the ROI on the investment. And the second thing I experienced, we were working with very large churches around the country that, had significantly large multi-million dollar budgets, hundreds if not thousands of staff, multi-campus. And I fell in love with the complexity of these organizational dynamics, all the way from the senior leadership, the board, senior leadership, mid-level management, all the way down. They very much reflect the exact infrastructure of any major corporate organization in America. I fell in love with that complexity. I fell in love with the challenges that all of these people were dealing with in terms of communication and how do we collaborate well and resolve conflict. And so in those two, when it was time for me to leave the kind of the shelter of my former mentor, I knew I wanted to coach. And secondly, I knew I wanted to work with high-level leaders of influence as they're wrestling with and navigating the complexity of not just building a business, because most of my clients, they're the ones that I work with hands-on, have already built something that's successful. It's the dynamic of, as a business grows, you have to add more people. And that's where the frustrations begin to really get serious.
Well, I'd like you to go back because you said the first thing had to do with how transformative things were, that you developed this system or the person you were being mentored by developed it. In what way? Or maybe you can tell a story of a client or something, but how is it more transforming than something else?
Yeah, so up to this point, what I had been exposed to, like I said earlier, was a lot of content information acquisition. Like you need to learn facts, information, dates, names, all that kind of stuff. And that meant you had learned something. But I think you and I would both agree that when you look into the model that Jesus used with his disciples, right? And if his model was to train people to be able to carry on his work, his mission, when he's gone, then it's probably worth paying attention to, like, what was his methodology? And his methodology was far less concerned with information acquisition, though those young men would have certainly had a pretty good education up to that point. It was far more about how they lived, and which is what drew me to the Christian faith in the first place was, oh, this is an invitation to experience a transformed life. Like I can become a better version of myself. But the problem was, no matter how many books I read, no matter how many conferences I went to, I didn't know how to unlock that better version of myself. So along comes this mentor. And what he had developed were kind of a series of simple visual tools that bridged the gap between the academic information dynamic of education, which is important. That's a part of it. But had bridged the gap from the education or information component to the application component. So these simple visual tools became a way of translating the principles of truth that we subscribe to, which is no different in the leadership space. There are a variety of principles and truths that we believe in the leadership space regardless of where we're operating, but had attached them to these visual tools, which made them now functional applications. So like just like you turn on your smartphone and you push the button and it opens an app, and the app performs certain functions with certain inputs to give you a particular output. That's what we're all looking for. We want to know, what do I have to input into my life to get this particular output? And so these tools served in that way. And through that process, first and foremost, I experienced radical transformation at every level, from my sense of clarity around my identity, my significance and purpose in life, to my character, really becoming increasingly more aware of those areas of my my mindset that I had inherited or adopted over the years that were not producing ideal results in either relationships or decisions I was engaged with, all the way to clarifying or providing a mechanism for being able to say, okay, how do I continuously become a better version of myself? So now fast forward to today, what I have done in my coaching business is take the best of what I learned from this gentleman and all the other amazing leaders whose shoulders I now stand upon, and have developed my own version of what I call a leadership operating system, which is a simple set of visual tools that will, once somebody downloads this operating system, actually empowers them practically to translate these incredible leadership principles and truths into like everyday practice, if that
Now,
makes
well, give me
sense.
an example of one.
Yes,
Let's drill down and really
let's drill
look at
down.
one, because the overall visual sounds good. And it's interesting you talk about being in a church environment, whether on the inside or on the coaching side, and that there were limitations when you're on the inside. Do you know John Jackson up at William Jessup?
I'm not familiar with that name.
You would love John if your paths ever cross. So he's called himself a pastorpreneur. So the pastor entrepreneur, and he's
Yeah.
doing a dynamic job, dynamite job up there at William Jessup, growing the organization up here, and it's in our area. But talk to me about one of these.
Yeah,
And let's dive in and get some specifics. Try to get that visual you're talking about across to our
absolutely.
audience.
Yeah, so we'll start with kind of where we start with most of our clients. I mean, now I no longer work in the church space. I now work in corporate space, and I've translated all these, because truth is truth wherever context you go into, right? So, but one of the first tools we introduce people to is what we call the pathway of personal responsibility, and it's simply predicated on this idea of like, at some point we've got to choose whether we're going to keep blaming the world around us for why things aren't turning out our way, and why we have terrible attitudes and behaviors, why we're reacting poorly to our environment, or we're going to accept 100% personal responsibility, which says, I can't control the world. I can't control my spouse, my kids, the economy, politics, which is a great conversation to have in this era, this season. I can't control my boss. I can't control my clients, my customers, my coworkers. But here's one thing I am absolutely responsible to be in control of at all times and in all contexts, and that is, those are my attitudes and my behaviors. And so we talk about how we spend so much energy overly focused on trying to conform the world into our expectation, rather than paying attention to what's really the issue in our life, is what's happening internally. So we call it looking beneath the hood of the car. And we present this under the banner of, what does it mean to be emotionally intelligent leaders? And so I've borrowed from Daniel Goleman, who's kind of known as the kind of the grandfather of that conversation piece, and have innovated on a matrix that he originally designed that has these 4 quadrants. And there's the 2 above quadrants in our iteration, which is, in everyday life, we got to deal with our awareness of other people and how we engage with other people. And then we have the lower 2 quadrants. That's our awareness of ourselves and how we manage or lead ourselves. And what we tell people is, whatever we cultivate in those lower 2 quadrants is what we're going to project in the upper quadrants. In other words, whatever we cultivate internally is what we're going to project externally. And if we're not intentionally engaged in the practice of self-awareness, we cannot practice personal responsibility. And so we simply diagram and show people that there are simple core skills that allow us to practice self-awareness. Because if you ask people what is self-awareness, they're going to get a million definitions. But we want to put boots on the ground. What are the practical skills? Well, first, it's practicing brutal honesty. And we talk about how we all have blind spots. We can't practice honesty in a vacuum. We need feedback loops from people that are trustworthy in our immediate surrounding. We have to know how to navigate the feelings of shame and guilt, regret, insecurity, fear that rise when we're exposed for the bits of us that are not so great.
Let's stay with the brutal honesty for a moment. So,
Sure.
with the brutal honesty, in my own experience for myself and then also with clients, there is a certain amount of awareness, but it often takes a long time for people to peel back the layers of the onion.
Yeah.
And well, you talked about the brutal honesty, and I agree that's true. I think you're right.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about, and maybe I'm cutting in too early, and the other steps are going
That's
to
okay.
address this, but I'm thinking of two different types of emotional awareness. One is the person's like, yeah, I want to learn more, but really doesn't understand where they are today.
Correct.
And then the second one would be the person who is a skeptic and is still in that. I'm going to use a different term, but you described it earlier, the victim mode.
Hmm.
My problems are other people.
Yeah.
They're bad, or their
Yeah.
behavior is this, or they did that, blah blah blah. So two different perspectives, but both of them are stuck. How does your system break either one of them out?
Yeah. Well, I think in both cases, um, it's we can lead the horse to the water, but we
Yeah.
can't make the horse drink. And so what our coaching process does is create space for people to ask really good questions about themselves.
Okay.
So before we even get into what I'm sharing with you today, there has already in our process there's already been a few sessions that is just creating an opportunity for people to take like a loose inventory of what's working and what's potentially not working in their life.
Yeah.
And then when we actually talk a little bit about what's not working, and then we ask the hard question, why is it not working? And then we say, okay, how many of the reasons for why things aren't working in your life, whether it's in your marriage, parenting, finances, health, whatever, how many of those reasons are a projection onto the world around you, that if the world just conformed to your expectation, then your life would be what you want it to be. And then the next question is obviously, could you imagine that any of the responsibility for where you feel stuck, frustrated, where things aren't working out, where you feel plateaued in your life, can you imagine the possibility of where you might actually have a role to play? So it's taking people gently through a process of them opening up to the possibility
Mhm.
that and we call out the victim and the villain mindset, and say these are the temptations of where we might go. And then we let people know, we say, hey, whether you play the victim or the villain mindset in response to what's not working in your life, either way, either of those paths leads to a form of bondage. Because what happens is you're now stuck in a prison waiting for somebody else to change something to release you. And the sad thing is, all the while, the key is in your pocket. But that pocket is in your wardrobe, which means you have to take personal responsibility to own that key, to take it out and to utilize it to set yourself free. Then we introduce what we call this pathway of personal responsibility. And then we move to, and if you want to practice this well, here's what it looks like. It begins with honesty, as we're talking about it. Then it means practicing humility, and not in the way that a lot of people have heard humility, which is thinking less of yourself or thinking of yourself less often. We define humility as a sober, not just view of who you are for better and for worse, but an acceptance that this is who you are today, whether you like it or not, whether somebody else likes it or not. Like, you cannot change what you cannot see. And one of the most difficult things, and I can tell you a context in which I found this most difficult to train leaders in, was in the church. And the reason is because in that culture, at least the parts of the church that I was exposed to, there is such a fear of being really open and honest about your deficiencies, for fear that it would disqualify you from leadership in a spiritual domain. And so this embracing, accepting, this is who I am. Now, can't stop there. Once we accept who we are for better and for worse, which actually, by the way, is the key to living with true confidence. Another story for another time. Then we got to practice self-love. And self-love is not this navel-gazing, thumb-sucking kind of preoccupation with yourself. Self-love is the bridge that gets us from who we are today, both in our character, in our competencies, in our capacity, and gives us permission to be on a journey of becoming a better version of us, to growth and development and personal transformation. And the things that get us stuck more than anything else is unforgiveness toward ourselves or toward other people, or an unwillingness to engage a process that does require the hard work of transformation and change.
Interesting, interesting. And you find that the value of ourselves, that's a key point. That's a key thing that has to happen for someone to do better in two areas up above. Because you
I
can't
mean,
be nice
because
to other
those,
people unless you're nice to yourself, right?
yeah, exactly. You can't give to others what you've not cultivated internally. I wish it were possible. I think we can fake it a little bit, but I just tell people all the time, you cannot give to others what you have not cultivated internally. I know this from personal experience. I know this from training thousands of leaders now over the years, that as human beings, the way that we are hardwired, it doesn't mean, let me say this clearly. It doesn't mean if you come home in a bad mood, you can't shift your mood and then treat your family well just because you had a bad day. You had to cultivate the ability to shift your mood so that you could shift your mood. Otherwise, you'll bring your bad mood home and now you'll corrupt your household that evening with your bad mood.
Well, so this is, if I remember correctly, this is the first of the visual exercise you've got, and you got a new book out that talks about like all 12, correct?
The new book is coming out in 2025. Yeah, the first book was on this
Okay.
emotional intelligence tool. Then the second book was on a tool that really just gives us a simple way of identifying and processing the life experiences that we have every day so that we can actually learn from them and experience transformation. Yeah.
Interesting. And so what brought about your desire to do that book after the first one?
I call it dummy tech. Some people would say it's not that bad. The first book I wrote because when I started this coaching business, I wanted to put a foot into the conversation around emotional intelligence, because I think Daniel Goleman did incredible work, but I think the conversation is a bit too narrow. I think the emotional intelligence, it has to include not just our emotions, but it has to include our mental mindsets. It has to include our physical well-being. It has to be a mental, emotional, and physical reality, because as human beings, we are integrated in those three ways. So you can't separate them out. And so that was the purpose of the first book. Then I wrote the second book, and then after writing the second book, somebody said to me, if you're going to write one book for every one of the 8 core tools, and each book takes you about 2 years, you've got a couple decades before you're going to get all these in print. Would you be willing to pause and write a book with the entire toolkit, which we refer to as a leadership operating system? Would you be willing to do that? And I said, I think that's a better idea. So I took the last year to write a book that basically introduces the leadership operating system metaphor, and then the short chapter introductions to each of the core tools that make up the operating system.
And so how does the operating system work? Is that to manage people, or is that to help them increase their emotional intelligence?
Yes to all the above, right? So there's a lot of different systems out there. This is my approach because, quite frankly, it's what unlocked the things that are in this operating system, are what unlocked my potential for me, and so that's what I've been trying to share with other people. So the 8 tools operate in 3 distinct ways. Each tool provides a clear vision or picture of what kind of leader or person we want to be. And it's 8 different snapshots or angles at what kind of leader or person or human being do we want to be. And interestingly enough, David, I've not yet worked with one client, doesn't matter what their background or station of life, that has said, that is not the kind of leader or the kind of human being I want to be. It doesn't matter their religious background, doesn't matter their status, their level in an organization. Never had one leader say, nope, this does not reflect who I would love to be as a human and as a leader. So
So
first
wait
they
a
give
minute.
us,
So wait a minute. So Does the process then tell them you're going to be this type of leader, or is it giving them
The
some type of
tool, yeah, the tool paints a picture of this is the kind of we want to be emotionally intelligent leaders. We want to be learning and responsive leaders. You know, each tool
yeah,
represents a different expression of leadership. In total, we would have
okay,
a great leader. So they provide a picture. The second thing each tool does, they act like diagnostics. It's like a mirror. So each tool gives a person an opportunity to, as they're reflecting on the tool, which should sound familiar to you because this is the way that Jesus's parables operated. People reflected on a parable. It didn't make sense immediately, but the more they reflected on the truths, principles in the parable, they would start to see things about themselves that they thought, oh gosh, I need to pay attention to that. And so that's why some of the parables were so offensive, because some of the religious leaders of that day started saying, hey, are you talking about us right now? Are you trying to indirectly get at us? So each
yeah,
of the tools gives us a diagnostic so that we can continuously reflect through each of the 8 tools to check, am I operating in alignment? Because baseline, each tool is an operational tool. Like, am I operating according to in alignment with this tool? And then the third thing it does is it acts like a window. It transforms the way that we engage other people. Because, like I said, we can't give to others what we haven't done in ourselves. So the first thing is, let's get a clear picture of leadership and the kind of person we want to be. That's what the tool do. Second is, let's make sure that we are doing the work to conform our attitudes, our behaviors, our way of operating to these 8 core tools. And then we're now set up to be able to lead others effectively through the lens of these 8 tools. So
interesting.
think of it like this. Think like this. I call it a leadership operating system because it's more than an app. You can read a great leadership book and it's a solution to a particular problem. An operating system, the genius of an operating system is once you download it onto your device, you don't see it, you don't really know what it's doing, but here's what you do know. Without that powerful operating system, whether Apple or Microsoft or whoever, without that operating system, you don't get to run all of the hundreds or thousands of apps that are solving a million different problems. And so what I discovered years ago for myself and then for other people is we all have an operating system that we've inherited, developed, adapted over the years. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. All this toolkit does is affirm the parts of our operating system that are functional and beneficial to ourselves and to the people around us, and gives us a chance to upgrade dysfunctional, unhelpful parts of our operating system to ones that are more helpful to ourselves and other people. And then what I tell people is, it doesn't matter if you're CEO or a vice president or a departmental leader or, you know, further down the track, the more people within any team or organization that are operating with this operating system, it's like having a bunch of elite athletes. If they're not playing from the same playbook, then it's very limited chance that they're going to collaborate and achieve something great.
Interesting. So, and currently, what you do is you and your team bring this out to people in a coaching mode. But one thing I want to draw out is that you mentioned that they need to get feedback in the brutal honesty thing, but I don't know whether that's ongoing. They need to get feedback from people that they trust, and I'm assuming that people they trust also have some experience, some wisdom. And so, how does that work? They're working on themselves. You have a coach that's giving input and direction, but being a coach myself, I know sometimes I don't get the full picture from the person
Of course.
because they don't see everything. So how do you incorporate the others? Is it just that they're touching base with them, or is there some other feedback mechanism in there that helps the coach be their best?
Yeah, so when we introduce the tools, most of what we're doing with the client is walking them through various exercises that they can do at some point when we're not around. Because the goal is that these tools become functional, practical, day in and day out, they can use them. So for example, with the feedback, we teach about feedback and the importance of feedback and why we need it, what to do with that feedback. Not everybody's going to give us feedback that's either accurate, helpful, spoken well, all that stuff. But we need that feedback loop. And so we part of the assignment they get when we're going through this part of the process is to identify 1, 2, 3 people in their life. And there are parameters for these people. They could be your spouse, they could be an adult child, they could be a coworker, they could be a boss, they could be a mentor, they could be a neighbor. We're looking for people who cross paths with us enough in a particular area of our life that we could go to them and say, hey, listen, um, I would love to hear from you where my impact in this environment that we share together, where is it helpful? Where do you feel like my impact is helpful? Thank you. I'd also love to hear, where do you feel like I could potentially improve my impact in this environment? Because the way you word the question obviously matters, right? If you go to a
Yes.
subordinate and say, hey, I'd love for you to tell me where I'm blowing it, no subordinate ever is going to share anything because they're terrified to get fired. But the way you word the question, we put the responsibility on the person being coached. You need to solicit feedback. You need to do it with some regularity. These are the kind of people. So we basically provide for them a simple framework so that as life changes and they move jobs and they live in a different city and their stage changes, they know, they understand that an important part of their ability to grow is to see their blind spots. And so therefore, it's going to be important to find the kind of people from whom we can get feedback, and then knowing what to do with that feedback is equally important. How we process it, how we learn from it, and the changes that we make because of the feedback. And that ties into the second tool that I was sharing with you.
That's great. So if people want to learn more about your leadership operating system and what you guys are doing, how do they find out more, Eric? If you want to close with any last encouragement for them to really dive into part of your system or not.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, David, I'm not familiar with your system, and I tell people ask me, well, what makes your system better than somebody else? I said, I don't think it is. I think they're oftentimes different because we're all coming from different perspectives. So I'm equally excited to learn more about your system. They can go to our website, www.empowercoaching.com, which is spelled MPWR Coaching.com. We just took the vowels out. That was the idea of one of my clever young team members. And they can find everything there. We offer a free coaching call for anybody, and people are always shocked that I jump onto a lot of those calls. They don't even need to know what to talk about. We ask all the questions. And then from there, they can get access to all of our online courses, the books that we've produced so far. They can get on the waiting list for the new book. Let me just finish with two simple thoughts that I think are just critical, David. First of all, I tell people over and over again, leadership is really hard. Leadership is really hard. And so for anybody out there who feels inadequate, they're struggling, they're feeling insecure, they're not sure if they have what it takes. It doesn't matter at what level. I work with CEOs, owner operators, all the way to mid-level management who feel this insecurity and inadequacy. And I just tell them, that's okay, because leadership is really hard. It is really hard. And most of us did not spend a lot of time in school, in leadership courses, learning wonderful leadership principles and practices. Most of us probably feel behind the eight ball. So I just tell people, you're not alone. So rather, I think the temptation is to think, I'm the only one that doesn't understand this. I'm the only one that doesn't know how to lead my team or how to get the best out of the people around me or myself. I just tell people, you're not alone. It is hard. And then the second thing is, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly until you get better. We have such a reluctance to grow as we get older for fear that we're going to be seen as not great at something. I just tell people, you learn something new, you're going to suck at it. You're not going to be good, and that's okay. But if you persist, you will get better. And so we encourage people, if people want to become better leaders of themselves, and because a lot of your listeners out there are going, oh, I know different areas of my life where I'm really struggling to lead myself, to curb my temper, to operate with composure, to not, fly off the handle, to not become passive or passive aggressive. Or if people are wanting to learn how to lead the people around them, and that could be in their household, that could be in their marriage, that could be in a Fortune 500 company. If you want to be a better leader of the people around you, if you want to learn how to empower the people and to get the most out of the people around you, the beautiful thing is the operating system provides both. And so we encourage people, if we can be helpful to that end, great. There's a lot of other people doing something similar. But I just tell people, find somewhere to start and start.
Awesome. Well, I hope people check it out. And I really thank you for being on the show, Eric. Been a good
Thank you for
conversation.
having me, David. I appreciate it.